I went to the Taranaki Garden Festival where people open up their private gardens for the public to be able to see. Found it very inspiring. I took my caravan to a campground in New Plymouth right by the beach with a great playground that Reese loved. There are actually multiple festivals happening all at once that are garden or arts related. I focused more on the sustainable backyards, but also went to some Centurion Taranaki gardens. And I'm going to share my biggest takeaway points from all the gardens I went and saw. My absolutely favourite garden was in the more traditional Centurion Garden Festival section, which was a little bit surprising. She does lots of accommodation and courses as well. She's described as a suburban permacultural garden, all about self-sufficiency and growing food, which is really what I want to be able to achieve on our land. I loved her food forest. It's been the favourite one I have seen to date. She was using a mix of ground covers like comfrey or apple mint, which I actually already have in my starter food forest. But the interesting thing is she used a lot of wood chip to suppress all the grass and the weeds. So it was that mix of some herbs and the wood chip. It just gave a really natural, beautiful feel. I've seen some food forests where it's just all purely wood chip with the little fruit trees sticking up, or it's just chaotic grass growing everywhere and weeds. And I think I really loved her style. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to try to achieve with mine now. The other interesting takeaway for me was the espaliered fruit trees everywhere. She even had some along her driveway and some as just little really low borders, just one little line. And I'll admit it made me very curious and inspired to try that myself one day. Another garden I did enjoy was called the Whitley Ridge in the sustainable backyard section. They also had an impressive food forest which had had years to develop. Lots of fully grown fruit trees, and I love that kind of weaving, wild, looking around corners feel of the place. They also used a lot of comfrey and herbs, but the interesting thing is they had my dreaded buttercup weed everywhere, and they did say it had kind of taken over on the lead up to the festival and they just mowed it all down. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to avoid. I absolutely hate buttercup weed in my garden. So yeah, I'm leaning towards the other one where I've got lots of bark down to try to kind of suppress this weed. Some interesting points from her were that her hazelnuts and her mulberries had failed to produce anything in all the years that she had them. I don't know if it's maybe the mulberry prefers the colder environment like what we have here. I have planted a couple of mulberries already, so fingers crossed I have more success. And then I was wondering, she only had about 3 hazelnut trees, so I have planted a huge amount and plan to plant a lot more as hedging. And I'm wondering, maybe she didn't have the right pollinator, or she needed more for the wind pollination to happen. Again, hoping that I end up getting some hazelnuts. They also had this amazing big hotbed that produces a lot of heat from the decomposing matter underneath, and I think that's something I really need to try here because our growing season is a little bit shorter than a lot of other parts of New Zealand. And another inspiring sustainable backyard was called Udonia. Her mission was cultivating healthy soil, and she had a paddock divided up, trying completely different methods to see which one produced the best soil. It was very systematic and data driven, and I am really curious to see her results. The biggest thing I took away from her garden was the power of shelter belts. She had focused on big native trees and shrubs along the edges of her land, and it really did create warmer sections or microclimates to grow different plants. I really need to up my game on focusing on the shelter belts, I think, on our land. She also had collected a lot of scrap wool from her local carpet shop and actually turned them upside down, which was interesting. I have heard carpet is good for weed suppression, but I have struggled to get wool. I've only been able to find synthetic, which I've then been warned will break down and litter the soil with plastic. So I'm keeping an eye on, maybe give it a 2-year max before I rip them all up, and hopefully I'll have sourced some wool carpet that I can then lay down to stop the weeds. Another sustainable backyard garden was called Kievi. I think I pronounced that wrong. This was a newer garden and maybe just a year ahead of my own, so it's good to see the progression of my own garden. She also has a lot of tree lucерns like me. They are a wonder plant, fast growing, good shelter, fodder for chickens and sheep, and good chop and drop for, building up your soil. They really are a versatile plant. Her place had amazing views, but her problem seems to be the wind, so she had to protect a lot of her fruit trees with these elaborate barriers. I suppose my problem here on the land is frost and hers was wind. She had some sheep. The biggest tip I learnt was that Wiltshire sheep shed their own fleece, and Wiltshire sheep are very popular in New Zealand. I have been thinking about getting that type for our land one day too. They're like ideal for small lifestylers. She said she found that the double electric fence works well on them, but it doesn't on the other breeds because their wool is too thick. She had a chicken tractor up the hill, which is very popular on YouTube right now to be able to move your chickens around. But she said she kind of moved it there and then it stayed put. That's become their permanent home. She actually had multiple different breeds of chickens dotted around at different locations, and some ducks, which she said were very good for keeping the slug population down. I then went to Kaki Farm, which is a small market garden. My biggest takeaways were, again, a good shelter belt is priceless because they seem to have created a little microclimate in that area and were able to grow sooner in the season. They use a lot of wood chips around their plants, and they have the garden hoops like I have bought for my own garden, but they've also just bending metal to hold the bug netting off their crops, which is something I have to do, I think, for my strawberries and the bird netting. They cover the soil when not in use to protect the soil and kill off weeds, and they sometimes seem to use the hardy living green manure crops that I've been too afraid to use, thinking it would be too hard to kill off before starting to plant in it, but they seem to have no problem, so maybe I just need to give it a go. Tupari, which again I'm hoping I'm pronouncing correctly, is a public garden open all year round just outside of New Plymouth. It's on a very steep hill and it was established by the Matthews family in the 1930s. My biggest takeaway, they have so many different ground covers that I'd never heard of. I took lots of photos and looked them up. Some can't handle frost, so I can't use them here. Some are actually borderline weeds, so you can't actually purchase them. But I've now got a few ground cover options that I want to try here. Then I also really liked some of their small beautiful trees and some of their herbs that seem to be sprawling and look super healthy. So I'm going to track those down and give them a go too. Reese happily walked all the way to the bottom of that land and then wanted to be carried all the way back to the car, of course. I then popped into Hui Cemetery, which is maintained by volunteers and NPDC staff. It was surprising, kind of chaotic and beautiful. I didn't get much footage because Reese just wanted to be carried the whole time, made it a little bit challenging. I loved two plants in this area. I think it's red valerian. One of the volunteers said I could take some of the seeds, so I am attempting to grow some myself right now. And then there was this beautiful rambling rose just over some of the headstones. I think I'll have to go back there again. If you go to New Plymouth, I definitely recommend wandering around the cemetery. I also went to a place called the Gallery Garden. I had gone to see their vegetable garden, but it was actually other parts that caught my interest. She's got some lovely cherry trees, you know, with beautiful blossoms. I love the uses of her grasses and flax. It was just very formal, beautiful patterns in the garden. And there were a few other plants I took photos of, and I'm going to try and track them down. It really was a great introduction to other stunning gardening plants that, you know, you aren't edible, and the pure use is for visual enjoyment. I then visited Magpie's Rest. I accidentally turned up on one of their closed days. The sustainable gardens have different opening hours. You just need to really check the brochure, which I had not done. But she kindly let us wander around anyway. They've gone through similar stages to us, where they started in a caravan, then a sleep out before finally getting the house. She had a chaotic garden that is my preferred style, where it was part edible, part cottage plants. She had, again, shelter trees to create sheltered areas, but she used ones other than natives and some very pretty ones. I did take some photos. Unfortunately, they're a bit frost tender, so I can't plant them here. She had a lot of plants for sale, and I couldn't resist this climbing berry that I had not heard of before, and then I promptly forgot the name. So I've planted it, and we'll just have to see what type of berries it produces. We also talked about greenhouses versus polytunnels. I had finally decided on getting a polytunnel for here, but she was very much for greenhouses, and her main reason was good airflow. So I guess I'm kind of back to uncertainty again. And the last garden I'll mention was called So Sweet. It was a small suburban garden, very well looked after, lots of netting protecting their berries. I wish I'd actually bought their sorrel plant because it was beautiful. It had red veins. I haven't seen one like that before. Reese kept wanting to destroy things in their garden, so we kept the visit brief and moved on. Overall, I came back from that festival feeling really motivated and wanting to get stuck into the garden. We got a trailer load of wood chip, which I've already put down, and we really need another one. And I'll slowly get rid of some more grass and keep expanding the garden and slowly keep chipping away. And I'll keep improving my shelter belts too. So what part of that festival did you enjoy? Let me know in the comments below.